really on it.
Okay. I hope you all enjoyed that slideshow. I know there's some great, really cool, kind of jaw-dropping photos in there. So thanks to Vicki Monroe with California Department of Fish and Wildlife for putting that together for us. She's a member of our Respect Wildlife team. So our next speaker is Dr. Jayson Smith. He received a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a master's degree at California State University, Fullerton, before returning to UCLA for his doctorate. After several years as a postdoc at CSUF, he is now an associate professor of biology at California State Polytechnic, Cal Poly Pomona. Sorry, I can't do it. At Cal Poly Pomona, he teaches a variety of marine and environmental biology courses, including field courses on Catalina and in Hawaii. Dr. Smith conducts research in rocky intertidal habitats of heavily urbanized Southern California, focusing on long-term monitoring and change, marine protected areas, human impacts, and management, restoration, and introduced seaweeds. He is an active researcher with the coastwide multi-agency Rocky Intertidal Network, MARINE is the acronym, and participates in local conservation efforts with the Laguna Ocean Foundation and the Orange County Marine Protected Area Council. His research has been funded by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, USC Sea Grant, California Sea Grant, and the Ocean Protection Council. That is a pretty distinguished career. Thank you for joining us, Jayson, and tell us all about what's going on in the tide pools.
All right, well, thank you for having me. Yes, so I'm a professor at Cal Poly Pomona. I know a lot of you guys seem to be from the SLO area, so we are the Cal Poly SLO sister campus. I'll talk a bit about what I've learned over the last several decades working on human impacts in rocky intertidal ecosystems. A lot of this will be focused on Southern California, but the impacts are the same in Central and Northern California, and a lot of the species I'll be talking about are similar. So, you know, the rocky intertidal zone lays at the interface of land and sea. And of course, during low tides, the intertidal zone is exposed to the air. And that gives a wonderful and unique opportunity for people to see marine life in its natural habitat without having to get into the water or without having to scuba dive. And so people visit the local shores for recreational purposes, for education, for subsistence harvesting, fishing, photography, and a whole long list. And there's actually quite a bit of tourism that revolves around tide pooling. And so there's tide pool tours that you can pay for in San Diego. There's lots of online resources, and there's lots of cities that actually advertise you know, pristine tide pooling if you come to their cities. Now, of course, this has been going on for a long period of time, but more recently, this has really been highlighted in the media. And so here's a couple of articles posted in the LA Times and in San Diego about the large uptick in human use of intertidal zones over the last 6 or so months, and likely to be COVID related. And the reasons for this, you know, I'm not entirely sure. It could be food insecurity, and so people are coming to the intertidal zone to collect food. It could be that there's been so many closures of other entertainment avenues that going tide pooling is now a new thing. And there's also been a lot of social media talking about tide pooling and collecting within tide pooling. And so just to kind of give you an idea of the degree of visitation that intertidal ecosystems get, here's some data from a few different sources. And so if we look at Fitzgerald State Marine Park, they've been monitoring visitation for several decades. Unfortunately, I don't have any updated information here, but you know, you're looking at 100,000 visitors a year. We've been taking data with Laguna Ocean Foundation for the last 10 or so years, and you can see 70,000 visitors per year. I don't think there's a lot of sense to try to compare among different sites because there's different methodologies involved. So for example, this high visitation at Fitzgerald Marine Park, that's a pretty large intertidal habitat. Whereas Treasure Island is only getting 70,000, but that's a really small intertidal habitat. And so you can see this is the area that we count people in, and it's just really not that large. So 70,000 people per year, and that's an underestimate within this small amount of area. That's a huge number of people. And so while people are there, they're engaged in a lot of different activities. They're collecting organisms, they're handling, they're turning over rocks, they're walking and trampling on organisms. And so you can see from some of these pictures, very typical type behaviors, some very unusual behaviors at times. This guy riding a unicycle on mussel beds. And then on occasion, we get even our world leaders that are guilty of trampling. So I kind of want to go through the different types of impacts or different types of behaviors and what their impacts are. And so we start with collecting. And so collecting, people collect for a lot of different reasons, for baits, if they're fishing on shore, for food, or even in some cases for souvenir. I've seen anything from very small scale collecting, like 1 or 2 individuals, to very large scale collecting. That includes, you know, I even saw somebody fill their car trunk full of mussels at one point. Obviously these large scale collecting examples are a little more rare, but obviously have a very huge impact. But I don't want to ignore the small scale collecting, because again, if you think about this, that if one individual took a mussel or a sea star every time they were in the intertidal zone, with 70,000 visitors a year, you know, there's basically going to be nothing left in the intertidal zone. Collecting obviously is the more detrimental of the behaviors, because it automatically reduces abundances. It takes individuals out of the population. But one of the other indirect effects is that people tend to select larger individuals because they provide more bait or more food. And that means then the result is that there's a shift in the size and the age structure of individuals in the population, whether it be mussels or sea stars or anything else. So they tend to be on the smaller end and on the younger end. And given that we know that, especially with invertebrates, that there's a exponential increase in reproductive output with size, this shift in the size towards smaller individuals has a disproportionate impact on the reproductive output of that population. People are collecting a wide variety of things. You know, abalone was obviously a very popular item before they sort of disappeared among, certainly among Southern and Central California. Sea stars and mussels, owl limpets are on the larger end of the limpets, and apparently are very similar to abalone. Lots of different types of snail species, octopus, urchins, crabs, and even a variety of different seaweeds are collected by visitors. And mind you, I'm really focusing on recreational visitors, not commercial. Now, there are limitations to take, so there are regulations, and so certainly within marine protected areas there's no take, and then within non-reserves you must have a California Department of Fish and Wildlife fishing license, and they have limits here of 35 individuals for a whole suite of species like crabs and limpets and turban snails and urchins. And then for mussels and seaweeds, there is a 10-pound limit. And then there's some species that are often prohibited, sometimes only seasonally, but things like sea stars and lobster and abalone and barnacles. And then there's some rules about how you can collect. You're really not supposed to be using tools. You're only supposed to be collecting with your hands. However, compliance or knowledge of rules can be low. And so we often see collecting within MPAs. We know that people often will collect in non-reserves, but without a fishing permit. Or they'll catch more than they're allowed to catch. They'll go over the limit. They'll often use tools. You can see these people here using tools, or they may be taking prohibited taxa like these sea stars here. Some people like to turn over rocks and look for things that are underneath the rocks. There's actually a lot of really cool animals underneath the rocks, but turning over rocks does have a negative impact. You can crush organisms as you're turning over those rocks. You can knock organisms off the rocks and potentially cause them to die. About 20% of the time, rock turners return those rocks back to their original location and orientation, but oftentimes they leave them upside down. And so if there's a lot of seaweeds that are growing on top of that rock, they're now upside down, and those are going to die. Or do you have a lot of obligate under rock species like these flatworms and some of these crabs and chitons that now will be exposed to the sun and probably won't do very well. You have a lot of people that are handling, and so they are picking up organisms like this giant black sea hare or pulling sea stars off the rock here. And so this can damage organisms, potentially reduce their fitness. As you tear a sea star off the rock, for example, that oftentimes leaves behind a lot of tube feet. If you're pulling limpets or chitons off the rock, that might reduce their attachment strength, and so they may die even if you try to stick them back on the rock. And then on occasion, you'll see people, for example, taking sea stars out of the low intertidal zone and sort of walking around with it and showing their friends and then putting it back down, but in the high intertidal zone where they might not be able to survive. And then finally, all visitors are guilty of trampling, and so they are walking on organisms and causing compression damage for soft-bodied organisms, or maybe crushing organisms that are shelled like mussels, or maybe even knocking organisms off the rock. And so this picture here is a really good example of this. This whole stretch of rock here is or was a rockweed bed. And rockweeds are actually really important in the intertidal zone, as I'll explain a little later. But because of repetitive trampling, this is basically just a bare rock path. You can see a little bit of rockweeds on the outskirts, but trampling has basically cleared that whole area. All right, so just to kind of summarize across all of these different impacts, you see from human use or human visitation that there's reduced abundances, there's injury or reduced fitness, there's shifts in the size and the age structure of the population, especially for collected taxa. There's reduced reproductive output. And then something I didn't mention was these cascading effects, where if you impact one species, then that could have impacts on a lot of other species as well. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. All right, so as a scientist interested in trying to determine what these impacts are from visitors, there's lots of different ways you can do this. You can compare high-use sites with low-use sites, and so you do a bunch of surveys and figure out where there's differences between the two types of sites. And this is more of an observational approach. On rare occasions, you might be able to do what's called a before-after control impact study, maybe a place that has been closed off to human visitation for a long period of time, but is going to be open for one reason or another. You can do a bunch of sampling before it opens and then sample afterwards to see what the changes are. Or finally, you can do experimental studies or manipulations where you're actually, like this example here, actually trampling a known amount of steps on a fixed location over time, and you look at what the impacts are. All right, so just to sort of summarize what the impacts we've seen, and I'm going to do this in a very general sense. So if we look at the low-use sites in comparison to high-use sites, the low-use sites tend to have twice as many sea stars, 6 times as many sea hares, 2.5 times biomass of mussels, 3 times the density of rare conspicuous invertebrates like these a lot more rising, a lot of different studies that I've done over time. And then in turn, the high use sites tend to be more characterized by lots of bare space because of repeated trampling and impacts, or lots of encrusting algae or this turf forming algae that you can see here, because these things tend to be more disturbance tolerant. And so the ecosystems really change towards really dynamic, productive type things to less productive, maybe less interesting, depending on who you are, types of organisms. And as I mentioned, the high use or taxa that tend to be collected tend to have smaller and therefore likely younger individuals. And so as I mentioned, larger individuals are targeted for harvesting by people. And so there's great examples with owl limpets, which is this one here, and mussels. And so places, this is a bit of a weird graph here, but the size of the circle is the mean size. And so you can see places like protected Channel Islands, the owl limpets are quite a bit larger than mainland sites that are open to human use. And then for mussels, this is a study I did where I compared the size structure. And so these are size bins, and then the percent of the population in those size bins. And so at high use sites, they're really truncated towards these smaller sized individuals, where at the low use sites, they tend to have a much wider range and a higher frequency of larger individuals. And then as I mentioned, the reproductive output increases exponentially with size. And so this is the gonadal weight based on the shell length of mussels. And so if we're removing a lot of individuals on this end, on the larger end, and most of the individuals on the population are down here, obviously that's a huge impact on the reproductive output of mussels for that site. Trampling and collecting of mussels, we know crushes mussels as you walk on them, or removes mussels obviously when you collect them. But actually there's a much larger impact that's kind of an indirect impact. And so if you're not aware, these mussels, they shoot out these what are called byssal threads out of their foot. And this is how they attach to the rock, and they attach to other surrounding mussels. And then they kind of clump together in these huge masses to make a mussel bed. When you crush one of these mussels, or when you pull out a couple of these mussels for food, you're breaking the attachment strength of all the surrounding mussels as well. And that weakens the infrastructure of these mussels and makes them a lot more susceptible to wave action. So there's an additional loss that occurs after people start removing mussels. For rockweeds, they make up these really large beds. This is a brown seaweed. And trampling will knock off individual plants, but actually more often it pinches off the branches from individuals. And so there's a loss of biomass for these rockweeds. But also problematic is all of the reproductive material for rockweeds are at the end of the branches. And so when people come through and they walk on these things and break off the branches, all that reproductive material just floats away. And therefore you don't get any localized recruitment, and these populations don't persist potentially for very long. The other problem with these two species, both the mussels and the rockweeds, is that they're considered ecosystem engineers, right? And so an ecosystem engineer is a species that facilitates the diversity or facilitates other species being able to live there. And so you can kind of see this mussel bed here, and we're only looking at things on the top. Now there's some seaweed here, there's a predatory snail here, here's some limpets, here's some acorn barnacles. Here's a little drawing of things that not only live on the shells, but they're living deep in that mussel matrix. Lots of worms and all types of things. And if I actually did a lot of mussel cores where I would collect all of this stuff, when I was a PhD student, and it's amazing how much stuff lives in there. Then for rockweeds, they're a canopy forming species. And so they kind of lay over the rock like a mop head. And if you lift this up, there's lots of things that live underneath there. And so when it's a really hot day and it's a low tide, the top of this will dry out and will get hot. But underneath that canopy, it'll be nice and cool and nice and wet. And so that provides habitat for a lot of species that otherwise couldn't be there. So these ecosystem engineers are really important, but yet we've shown time and time again that they are detrimentally impacted by human visitation. And then the last example here is actually one from Chile. I bring this up only because it's a really good example of a cascading effect on community alteration. So in Chile, they have this predatory snail. It's called Concholepis. And you can see some pictures of it here. It's a predator mostly on mussels. And so in places where this snail is overexploited, where it's harvested, you have a mid-intertidal zone that's dominated by pretty much only mussels. And that's because of predation release. And so because you don't have the snail here, the mussels are the competitive dominant and will outcompete everything else. And that leads to relatively low diversity. But in places that are not exploited and the snail is still present, you have a completely different mid-zone. It's dominated by barnacles and macroalgae, and you have a really high diversity of things. So two completely different types of intertidal communities, depending on whether that snail is there or not. All right, so lots of bad news here of the negative impacts caused by visitation. And of course, there's lots of visitation that's going on. But not all is lost. There are lots of management strategies like marine protected areas. We have lots of organizations, stakeholder groups, volunteers that are doing things that are improving things. And the next speaker, Claire Ari, will be talking a little bit more about this. So, and with that, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. We have two questions. The first one is, what are best practices for avoiding trampling? Should people be told not to walk anywhere but bare rock or sand?
Well, there's issues with that because obviously the public won't be able to enjoy the intertidal zone like they would if they were walking through it. And as much as I recognize the problems of visitation, I am a proponent of the public being able to learn and enjoy and understand how the intertidal ecosystem works, because they're the ones that are going to help protect it for the long term. We've thought about many different things, many strategies to reduce trampling effects, such as trying to create pathways in the intertidal zone. There are a couple places that have tried some of that. I think Fitzgerald Reserve has done that a little bit, but it's really difficult because it's such a harsh environment that you try to put up a boardwalk or a pathway and it gets destroyed pretty easily. And so the recommendation is to really walk gently, try to find bare spaces to walk in, and try to avoid really, really delicate things. And that's sort of the best approach that we have. It's really unavoidable and it's really hard to manage.
Sally has a question. She says, how can we convince U.S. Fish and Wildlife that all intertidal invertebrates and seaweed should be protected?
Well, I think there needs to be a balance between resource use, and obviously resource use includes exploitation. It's really a little beyond me to try to make that argument. But I think we just have to recognize that some people do use the intertidal zone for collecting of food or for other purposes. And we have to balance those things out.
Thank you. Next question. I often see people harvest seaweed out of the intertidal more than anything. Is there permitting for seaweed collection?
My understanding is that you do have to have a permit, and you're limited to 10 pounds a day. I don't know if anyone is from DFW here that can chime in, but that's my understanding. And then for some species, there's tighter regulations. So the northern sea palm, the kelp, and the seagrasses tend to have higher restrictions, or even some that collecting is prohibited. But a lot of the other seaweeds are not well protected and open for collection.
Thank you. Sally says, are you aware of the trampling studies that were done at Hazard Canyon and PG&E's properties by Steinbeck and al.?
I am aware of those studies. There are human use studies not only up and down this coast, California to Washington, but there's examples all over the world, and they all point towards the same thing, that trampling has a negative effect, collecting has a negative effect, handling has a negative effect, especially on particularly susceptible type species.
Thank you. Next question. Is there evidence that having rangers or docents in the tide pools actually helps prevent excess trampling and take? The tide pools in Monterey are almost all within marine protected areas, but there is almost zero daily management.
I am going to leave that to Claire to answer, because she will be talking exactly about some of these things. So good question.
Awesome.
Good lead in.
Thank you, Jason. Two more quick questions. Are there best practices for using educational viewing containers when bringing people to the intertidal?
That's a good question. We actually did a study where the city of Newport Beach had a mobile intertidal touch tank. And so they would drive this around it was actually to drive to different schools, but they also would park it near the intertidal zone, so that when people came by, they could go through this touch tank vehicle and see all these things before they go into the intertidal zone. And that had a couple positive effects. Of one, they get to see these things up close, so they don't have to touch them while they're actually out in the natural habitat. And two, that you could do a lot of outreach in that process. And we found that to be pretty effective in reducing some of the detrimental impacts of visitors. I don't know whether we've ever really thought about doing that actually in the field. I guess my approach would be do a similar type thing, but leave those organisms in place, but have an educator sort of pointing at different things and talking about those things.
There are two more questions. I'm gonna, if it's okay, share your contact information with the two other people.
Absolutely.
Just because we're out of time, but
Sure.
Really great questions, so I don't want to lose them.
Sure.
Okay, and then great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We are gonna do a spin it to win it game.